Uh, Professor Wendy Rouse is author of a book called Her Own Hero, The Origins of the Women's Self-Defense Movement, which was a big hit, I think, and it was published in about 2017. And Wendy is talking to me now. Hello, Wendy. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm okay. It's great to talk to you across these many time zones. Let's just hope that the internet doesn't let us down. Um, so you're a professor in San Jose, and you're a professor of sociology and interdisciplinary social sciences. What's your background? Where did you start?
Yeah, I'm a historian by training. So I studied history as an undergraduate, received my bachelor's degree from Sacramento State University, and went into history archaeology for a while, master's degree, and
Yeah.
then decided to explore the PhD program. So I started studying history, American history, specializing in progressive era, early 20th century.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's my
Um,
academic.
and the book was published. Did it come out in 2017?
Yes.
And it was a big hit, wasn't it? I mean, there was a lot of interest around it. The sense that I got, and I know I'm in Britain, so I'm very much on the other side of the pond, but I did get a sense that like it caused an immediate response. People read it immediately.
Yes, I think martial arts historians, especially martial artists in general, self-defense instructors, were very interested in it.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I got the book. I don't know if I got. I think I was sent a review copy, possibly even just before it actually came out. And the first thing that struck me was you used terms that as a Brit, like as not a historian, not an American, I didn't know when you were talking about. I didn't know what the progressive era was. I had to start Googling things. Is that like an American? That's a known term for American history, is it? The progressive era.
Yes, 1890 to 1920,
Okay.
approximately. This
Okay.
era of like reform and
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, I learned something on the first page. So, tell us the story. What precipitated your interest? It's women's self-defense in America. What was the origin? What's your origin story for your interest in this?
Well, it's really interesting because I started studying martial arts when I was 10 years old. I started studying Shotokan karate, and I progressed through that through high school, received my Shodan in Shotokan. And then in college, I started studying Uechi-ryu, which is an Okinawan system.
Mm.
And I studied that for 15 plus years and rose through the ranks in there and became a teacher, started teaching women's self-defense classes for teens and for adults.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I was going through my education. So I was getting my degrees, and working on history. And I never thought of connecting the two, of studying some sort of history of women's martial arts or anything like that. So I was actually working on my dissertation, which was a completely different topic, but it was progressive era. So it was turn of the century immigration history. Okay. And I was going through like the old newspapers from the time period, San Francisco newspapers, national newspapers really. And as I was scrolling through the newspapers looking for information related to my dissertation, I came across the image that is the cover image of the book. Okay. And that image surprised me because here you see a woman in the clothing of the era, right? And she is using these techniques, these self-defense techniques, these classic modern techniques of palm heel strike to try to take down an assailant. Yeah. And it confused me because my teachers had always taught us the story that women's self-defense, women's training in martial arts was really mostly emerged out of the second wave feminism, and that they were kind of the pioneers in their field. So I was confused because it's like, wait, this is much earlier than the 1960s and 1970s. So my curiosity was aroused. And so I clipped that. And then I just started this massive search, trying all these different search terms to see if I could come up with what was happening. Mm-hmm. So that's how the book began.
So what year was this when you began to search around a bit and think there might be a project here?
It was 2010, actually.
Okay.
2010. So it took a long time to come to the point where I thought there was enough material for a book.
And what's the date of the cover image? Is that
I believe that's 1904.
1904. And that's a classic. I mean, we would call that a palm heel now, wouldn't we? But
Right.
when I've looked at some self-defense, not self-defense, the military stuff that was being taught to soldiers, US and British and Allied forces during World War II, and the trainers used to call that a chin jab. And it was one
Interesting.
of the basic techniques that they taught to all kind of conscripts and all volunteers. It was the chin jab. And they used to train it like this. They'd get soldiers to do this, and they just practice smashing your hand into, and then that becomes an eye and a takedown. And then they also used to teach what they call the rabbit punch, which is the chop to the back of the neck to kill, because they used to kill rabbits. And then they would do an axe kick, but they would just call it like a heel stamp. And those are the three basic, because a chin jab can become an eye gouge, can become a takedown. And then, anyway, that I'd never really looked at the technique on the cover image, but that's a brilliant, devastating technique, isn't it?
Yeah. Awesome.
So talk us through the book. Where would you place the first kind of tremors of the origins of the women's self-defense movement in the United States?
Well, I found that it was paralleling the fight for women's rights to vote, especially in the UK and in the US, and kind of this physical empowerment era for all humans, right? That there was this real interest in physical fitness and learning about improving your health, and this anxiety over urbanization and the growth of the cities and the factory labor, that it was making people weak and threatening your well-being. And so it kind of emerged a little bit out of physical fitness movement and a little bit out of this women's empowerment feminist movement that was happening at the same time.
Okay, so you was it a direct response to an actual or a perceived increase in maybe harassment or sexual based assaults or crime? Was it or was it a response to maybe a moral panic about that? I mean, what do you
so in the book I talk about three different kind of motivations for women studying self-defense, and one is definitely a concern about street harassment and violence against women. The other has to do with the suffrage movement specifically, and then the third is about violence in the home. And all three of those factors come into play for women specifically. And I mean, women's place, Victorian society, 19th century, this whole concept of separate spheres, that a woman's place is in the home and men's place is in the public sphere, work, on the streets. And so women are, with the feminist movement, women are stepping outside those bounds. They're moving into the professional world, they're going to school, they're going shopping in the city. Like, they are starting to be more of a visible presence on the city streets. And what they find is a lot of backlash against that and a lot of harassment. And so there's a big concern as they are stepping out into the public. And we're talking about middle-class women, right? Because working-class women were already there in the public sphere and we're already experiencing this. But it's these elite kind of upper middle-class women, and they're experiencing the street harassment that's pretty similar to what women even experience till today. And they are getting frustrated with this, and how do we react? How do we behave? And they're getting all kinds of responses, from everything from, well, maybe you should stay home. Maybe you should have someone with you to protect you, like a husband or a male friend, to people saying, no, just, to claim your space, go out there, you have the right to walk down the street. And especially boxing instructors, jujitsu instructors, physical fitness activists started to really emphasize that women could do this. And women reached out to them and asked for lessons in boxing, and they actually called up gymnasiums and said, hey, can you teach us some techniques to protect ourselves? And so these instructors agreed and saw this whole new market open up for them.
Oh. And so, I mean, the time period is, it matches similar the suffrage movements and the birth of feminism in the UK, and I guess other European cities. Have you seen, like, is it comparable? Like, it emerges at the same sort of time across modern urban cultures or and countries, or are there different temporalities depending where you are in the world?
I really just focused on UK and US, but there is a similar thing happening in different parts of the world. And I think that will be an interesting thing for someone to study too, is to think about how this all connects.
You could look at the different demographic things and think, actually, in all of these places, this happened, then this happened, and then.
Yes.
And
I think it comes out of Germany too, right? With the physical fitness movement in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, and in Sweden and all sorts of cultures like that. Yeah. And the other thing, one thing that interests me is the question of like what did their training look like? You've mentioned boxing and you've mentioned other things. So I mean, in Victorian era Britain and Paris, Geneva, you were seeing the development of combinations, or the first combinations of Jujitsu and Bartitsu with the French savate, which is very elegant kind of kickboxing, with the Swiss lacan, which is the cane fighting or stick fighting, and it's very class-based. It has to look elegant, you know. It's for the Victorian gentleman, and the suffragettes kind of tapped into that energy. Is there a class-based dimension to what people are doing? You know, like a lady should do this, or a lady shouldn't do this kind of stuff. Do you see that in the US?
For sure. They were signing up for boxing classes, and there was an emphasis on the fact that ladies and gentlemen really shouldn't engage in direct, physical combat per se. So there was a lot of emphasis on bag work, on sparring, light sparring, and shadow boxing. So if a woman or even a man kind of crossed into the competition aspect of it and actually getting more into prize fighting, then that was considered really stepping across the line and of what was genteel culture at the time. And Jujitsu was very questionable at first when it came to the United States, because there was a lot of concern, especially among traditional boxers, that Jujitsu was more feminine, that it was not a manly art, that it was a reflection of Asian culture, of the yellow peril, of this deceptive means of fighting. And so they really racialized it as the other type of martial art. And it took a while for it to even become acceptable. And it was really Teddy Roosevelt, President of the United States, who pushed for and advocated for the adoption of Jujitsu. And among the American military, he studied it, he practiced it, and he thought, this is great. This is great. Why shouldn't we learn this? And why shouldn't the American military, why shouldn't they adopt these techniques? And so part of the reason why it became popular was because he was really pushing for it here in the US.
Okay, and that became a kind of a regular fixture of feminist self-defense at that point. So it was Jiu-Jitsu and Judo basis to feminist or to women's self-defense. Does that have an enduring history? I mean, is there something specific to Jiu-Jitsu, or are you aware of whether at a certain point it might get displaced by other arts, maybe, I don't know, Aikido, maybe Japanese styles, or does it run through the 20th century that it's Judo and Jiu-Jitsu and boxing?
It's Judo, excuse me. It's Judo and Jiu-Jitsu and boxing until World War II.
Okay.
And in World War II, with many of the soldiers being stationed in the Pacific, they begin to study other types of Asian martial arts. And that's where you see karate coming into the United States, and you see all different forms of martial arts. But it's pretty consistently Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, and boxing, from what I can tell, from 1904-ish into the 1940s.
But you say that so Jiu-Jitsu was regarded as something a little bit too foreign, maybe, and a little bit. In the stuff that I've read about, when I looked at a lot of kind of English and British self-defense books from as far back as I could possibly go, and by the time of the 1900s and through to the 1930s, really, Jiu-Jitsu was always tricks. it's like tricks, the tricks of the of the jiu-jitsu person, because like wrestlers and boxers, they were like, oh, I don't know how I feel about these tricks. And it wasn't called an art, was it? And it was just like some tricks that you could use, you could add it to your repertoire to become a more rounded prize fighter or whatever.
Exactly. So boxing and wrestling were seen as the traditional manly art, the traditional honorable means of fighting.
Yeah.
And jujitsu was seen as something that they did, this tricky culture. But because it was effective, that is part of why these boxers and these wrestlers started to say, well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe we should practice these tricks, right? And so in the military, once the military adopts it, then it becomes, a lot of the boxers and wrestlers end up learning these techniques, and then they kind of create what I consider the first mixed martial arts, where they combine techniques. Especially after World War I, they start to teach these mixed martial arts self-defense classes. And they become very popular because they are effective, and the jiu-jitsu techniques are more effective in some ways for self-defense purposes, especially for women, because they're using the passive resistance.
And I mean, there's two questions I want to ask at this point. One is, at what point do you find in media representations or in people's accounts jiu-jitsu no longer being a negative other, but some, or even maybe not even an exotic other, but something more domesticated? That's the first question. I think, do we start to see the reputation or the interpretation of judo and jiu-jitsu improving over time?
It's definitely improving over time throughout the 20th century. I would say that that's an interesting question to look at even for now, because even in the 1990s, when the UFC, the mixed martial art boxing came out, there was still this exoticization of jiu-jitsu, and this isn't, so we still even see that into the late 20th century. So yeah, I mean, it never quite even, I think today it's fully accepted for the most part, but it always had that tinge of otherism associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, I have this is not my second question yet. I really don't want to forget my second question, but I always feel that jiu-jitsu feels to me, especially Brazilian jiu-jitsu, now it feels a little bit middle classish anyway, because it's you need a lot of kit, and it's a bit like yoga, and the segue between Brazilian jiu-jitsu and yoga seems, and it's all done in studios, and it seems to occupy that kind of, it's got a cleanliness to it, but maybe that's a different. I don't know if I don't know what jiu-jitsu experience you have, so I'll not ask you to comment on jiu-jitsu. But I will ask you to comment on my second question on that subject, which was, so the women and feminists, and not even consciously feminist women, are looking to learn some self-defense skills, and presumably they're going to environments and to people who would be associated with masculinity, maybe what we would now call toxic masculinity. And what are we finding in the documents and in the archives about the gender politics of feminists going to alpha male, macho men to learn how to defend themselves? Is there anything that we're learning about that?
Sure. First, I want to add, before I start that there were Japanese American immigrants who opened up jiu-jitsu schools and specifically offered self-defense classes for women. So they're also going, in addition to the boxing gyms, they're also going to these jiu-jitsu studios to learn the training. But your question about toxic masculinity, yeah, for sure. They're confronting a lot of stereotypes from culture in general, that women are weaker, that women can't do the same techniques as men, that they need these modified training regimens. And so they're facing that to some extent. And some women push back against that and are like, no, I want to learn the real techniques. I want to actually practice this. I want to actually engage in sparring. So some women push back against that. Some women buy into that. But I think one of the toxic things, especially that emerges from the self-defense movement of that era, is some self-defense instructors kind of play into this idea that you need to always be very aware of yourself on the public streets, and you need to, not go out after a certain point of time at night. You need to always have someone with you. And so in some ways it kind of reflects back that idea that the street is not for women, that the street is for men who can defend themselves and women cannot. So I think that that's something that a lot of women started to push back against. And they actually, once women started becoming experts in jujitsu and self-defense, then there were more women became teachers. And then they would open up these gyms that were more feminist oriented. And they're like, no, you have the right to be on the street. We're going to teach you some verbal techniques, some physical techniques, some psychological techniques to empower you so that you know you can go out there. You can protect yourself. You don't always need someone to protect you. And so that was kind of a different way of thinking that pushed back against those ideas of masculinity.
So it's interesting though, because so on the one hand, the initially male instructors are giving a kind of moral injunction to the students, saying, yeah, I can teach you this stuff, but you mustn't go out, and women aren't meant to go out. But actually, when you look at a lot of the discourse of self-defense, even contemporary self-defense, it's very much a moralistic, like, why would you go out by yourself down a dangerous street anyway? That's still, you know, the self-defense books and feminist self-defense books seem to go, on the one hand, we have a right to not be afraid, but on the other hand, yeah, maybe don't go down that particular road. I mean, how do we judge the gender politics of that? I guess it's probably like, no one should go down that road, or
exactly no one should go down that road, right? I think you can see the difference today because we have still two types of women's self-defense classes. We have ones that are very much like, okay, you're going to come in, I'm going to show you a few techniques, I'm going to give you all the moral warnings about what not to do, and then I'm going to send you on your way. And then we have these empowerment feminist self-defense classes, which really say, okay, let's look at violence and let's look at all the different sources of violence against women. And it's not just that stranger, that stranger danger, right? Someone's going to jump out of the bushes, you're going to palm heel strike, and you're going to run away back to the safety of the lighted street and the police station. And so with the feminist self-defense classes, then they talk about, let's talk about psychological empowerment. Let's talk about recognizing danger far in advance. Let's talk about relationship violence. Let's talk about the real sources of violence against women, which are often not on the street, that are often in your workplaces and your homes. And so it takes a more holistic look at violence and sources of violence, and then a broader look at what empowerment means, using your voice, using your body, and then also obviously using these physical techniques. And so I think there's a huge gap still in the differences. And I do, having trained in a variety of different, so after I stopped training in Uichiru, I trained in different types of self-defense systems. So Krav Maga for a little bit, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There is still this culture of toxic masculinity in many dojos. And the emphasis in traditional martial arts is when women are being trained, there's some instructors view them still as weaker than men. And there's a lot of emphasis on modifying techniques, and we're not going to do it this way because you're women. And so I still see that kind of in a lot of traditional dojos. And it's just a simple shift in thinking that needs to happen in some self-defense classes and in some dojos.
So you wouldn't generalize across, like, by style, but you would talk about the atmosphere in a dojo
It's totally the atmosphere in the dojo, because I've been in excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools, excellent Krav Maga studios, and excellent traditional karate studios. But it's just by the instructor and their mindset about what men and women are capable of. So
when you've taught self-defense, I don't know if you still do or not, maybe you're too busy nowadays, but when you have, which style have you emphasized? I mean, do people walk in the room and you go, okay, we're here for a workout, but this is a useful workout? Or do you also do the situational awareness and like, how do you navigate that?
I spent a lot of time teaching young teenagers and young women in university how to defend themselves. And a lot of the first few weeks is actually on using their voice and on recognizing their personal space and boundaries, and kind of unlearning some of the passivity that they've been taught over their life. And that's a huge part of just the beginning stages of it. And then you move into the physical. And the physical techniques are a combination of literally like everything. a little bit of jujitsu, a little bit of traditional boxing style, punching, striking, karate techniques, and then a lot of jujitsu style techniques as well to try to get straight to the effective strategies that are quick and easy to learn.
And do you still find even today that gender is imposed on us in those typical patriarchal ways, so that young women really they have become something with that they haven't learned how, like the classic feminist thing about throwing like a girl, and like learn how you learn gender. So you're trying to undo gender, and you're trying to unlearn it, and teach them that actually you have got this which we would associate with masculinity,
right?
This kind of energy. Do you find that that's a huge thing, or are some of your students like as aggressive and as powerful and as projecting of confidence as you would traditionally associate with masculinity in a patriarchal society?
I think women are as powerful physically, but oftentimes they have to tap into their verbal skills, especially setting boundaries and being able to say no. I mean, that's so hard for women that have been trained in this culture that it's not polite to say no, or to think of other ways to not hurt the other person's feelings, and to maybe, let them off easy or whatever. So just getting young women especially to say no. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Don't come any closer, or no, I'm not interested, and walking away. Like, that is a huge step. And because of all of the gendered training that even from a young age with girls and children, they're constantly being told that they have to be polite, they have to be nice. And so it's so hard for women, by the time they're teenagers, by the time they're entering into the university or they're going into their adult life, it's so hard to say something as simple as no. And so we work a lot on that.
So how were if we go back to the progressive era, and we go back to the birth of the women's self-defense movement, how were the first female martial arts students, how were they navigating their gendered kind of performance of what it is to be a proper person? Does that come up at all?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. They were told that when they're on the street, and this is like the traditional, like, polite thing to do, is they should not make eye contact with anyone, and they should not talk to anyone, a male especially. And so they were taught to be very passive and to try not to in any way suggest that they're not respectable, right? They don't want to give any kind of sense that they're not a respectable middle upper class woman. So for them, when they were harassed, when someone would come and sit next to them or try to touch them or say something inappropriate to them, that was a huge transgression, even more so than today when somebody gets catcalled or something, right? I mean, to catcall someone back then was a huge breach of normal, acceptable behavior for these middle class women. So for them, they were also working on verbal self-defense. And some of the self-defense classes talked about, okay, so they're on the streetcar and someone gets too close to them or says something to them, what do you say back? How do you set that boundary? And so sometimes it was just literally speaking up, saying something, calling for a police officer, and that was a big deal for them to just be able to do that.
Do you find is this in manuals, or is it in newspaper articles, or is it in what were your archives for finding out this kind of information?
Mostly in newspaper articles, though there are a few manuals. The newspaper articles were fascinated by this trend of women studying jujitsu and boxing. So from 1904 to about 1920, there's a bunch of articles on it. And some of the articles are literal tutorials, like, this is what to do in this situation, because self-defense instructors were suddenly very popular. And so they would write articles into the newspaper and they had like diagrams of, how to do each technique and advice on what to do on the street. And the courts were concerned too. So this is the progressive era. So the courts are very active and involved in trying to reform society. And so the courts were also interested in this, and the police. So when a woman started to file complaints about this, it kind of became a a Me Too movement of that era, with women sharing, this happened to me on this street in this part of town, and this happened to me. And so then the police there's more demand on them to try to do something. And so when women would file complaints, then instead of just, okay, whatever, they started to feel the pressure that they needed to actually issue fines and jail time for men who were harassing women on the streets.
Okay. And if I'm just thinking about moving this, I mean, I want to ask some questions that aren't necessarily gendered, but they always are. But I've read before I read your work, I read the work of Emmeline Godfrey on Victorian self-defense, like masculinity and self-defense and femininity and self-defense. And when her take on it, it's the same as yours. It's in the sense that it's about modernity and about the fears of urban menaces of different kinds. So I'm just wondering about the identity of the urban menace in the States, because in Britain, 19th century Britain, you're dealing with colonial subjects, you're dealing with migrants such as the Irish, which is where we get the word hooligan from. So the white middle classes of Britain are worried about Indians, because hence you get the word thug from the Thuggee cult in India, and hooligans, which is the Irish. So it's very, very reflective of the colonial structure of Victorian British society. So who were the urban menaces, apart from just men? Like, can that group be broken down a bit more in this US context?
Yes, it was racialized as not just men, but men of color. Men of color were the menace. And this was often coded in the newspaper articles, but it's clearly there. So the concern was that the shadowy stranger on the street was an other. It was a Black man who was a rapist, who was out to prey on white women. Yeah. It was an Asian American, an immigrant especially from China. They were seen as the yellow peril, and that they were living as domestics in many people's houses. They were working in the kitchen, right? They were cooks, they were servants, and this idea that they could be sexual predators preying on children, preying on the women of the household. There was also a concern about Southern and Eastern Europeans, that these immigrants were, especially from Italy, that they were potentially sex traffickers running these prostitution rings, and that they would drug women and assault them and then lead them to a life of shame. So all of these were the coded messages that were not often directly addressed in the newspapers on self-defense, but it's there, and you can see those themes.
So who are the safe people? The safe people are just like white, second, third generation English speaking. These are the safe people, I'm guessing.
So what's interesting is that the women were told, don't trust these other people, but you can trust the white men, especially the middle, the upper class men. They are your fathers, they are your uncles, your cousins, your friends, they're your protectors, they're your natural protectors. But what's interesting is some of the feminists began to speak out against even that concept. I mean, some of them played into it, don't get me wrong, they're not all like against this, but some of them started to speak out about that, and they actually pointed to examples of domestic violence, of family violence, to say, look, women aren't safe in their own homes. White, middle class, upper class women aren't safe in their own homes from the very men who are supposed to be their natural protectors. And they were highlighting that as an issue, but what they found is the more they talked about that, the more pushback they got, and the more anxiety about giving women any rights. And so those are the radical women in the movement that are bringing up those issues. And so they found over time they had to kind of, okay, let's not talk about family violence and domestic violence as blatantly. Let's work on getting the vote. And when we get the vote, then we can try to address some of those issues.
Wow. So they would often have some degree of support from respectable men, but as soon as there was a chance that the domestic scene, the middle class or upper class domestic scene, might be a contentious place, then they close down. Okay, that's really interesting. So What about current work in and around self-defense? Are you doing any more research on this? Is there another book on the way, or?
No, I thought for a while I thought I might do something in the 20s and 30s, but I've kind of steered away from that now. I'm working on a different direction. I started to be interested in the suffragists themselves and some of their life stories. There were a few suffragist American women who went to the UK and were arrested along with the suffragettes of the WSPU. And so I was interested in them. I'm interested in their lives and their relationships and the connections between the suffrage movement, the transatlantic suffrage movement. So I've kind of actually moved in that direction and
Okay.
looking at some of that, but I have not done anything recently with the self-defense.
Okay, that's really interesting because I mean, I was talking to Evelyn Godfrey. I'm sure your paths have crossed and you've read each other's work and everything, but she's moving in a very similar direction. Like she's interested in certain figures and who were they and what was their stories and what were their motivations, and so that's it's great. We're going to get more kind of biographical focused studies of players in the. Oh shush! I hate it when that happens. Things go bing. But yeah, no, that's great. That's really, really interesting. So is that how far along in the project are you with that? Is that new or?
I'm in the beginning stages, so I'm still working on it, but it's a suffrage themed work and looking at relationships between women in the suffrage movement and the transatlantic connections as well.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It's this is therapy for me when I can't get training partners and I can't really write. It's great to speak to really interesting people, and you are a very interesting person. So thank you very much, Wendy Rouse.
Thank you.